Hello and welcome to the next in the video lessons of the Britain 1900 to 1951 course. The usual disclaimer applies. This is focusing on the analysis and the arguments one would make as opposed to specific evidence. You have to find specific evidence yourself from the reading. So today's lesson we're looking at is a fairly common question I'd like to ask because it's fairly easy to people to hazard an answer, but it's very easy to see how much understanding someone has of the complexities of the coalition government and David Lloyd George by providing a more nuanced, sophisticated answer. So the big question is obviously, why does David Lloyd George fall from power? And there are many, many different arguments and interpretations. If you remember back from the last lesson, David Lloyd George was fundamentally done in by his coalition partners who rebelled against him ostensibly around the Chant crisis and the honour scandal, but as we've seen, their hostility was relatively deep from day one, and there was pretty much a contractual relationship between them and David Lloyd George. He remains popular, they keep him in office. As he lost his popularity, in order to keep them happy, he also lost his usefulness. So he ended up being kicked out of office. Most people thought he'd be back, however that was his greatest point, and he ended up going to a slow decline into political relevance and unimportance. And so when we look at the arguments we have for David Lloyd George, there are sort of 5 major areas we can focus on, but in reality we can gather them up. Okay, so number one, one point looks at David Lloyd George himself. He is ultimately a flawed individual. That's why 1863 is a bit of an arbitrary date when he was born. He's a flawed individual, both in his arrogance, his ambition, his inability to really see the truth, and I argue that made him a very effective second man as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and argue made him a very effective war Prime Minister, but a peacetime Prime Minister, particularly in charge of the coalition, unfortunately was beyond him. And so this can be linked to many of the other factors, and you can often explain some of the other factors I'm about to mention as being a result of his flawed character. We're going to evaluate each of these arguments in turn. You can also argue that the split in the Liberals ultimately meant that he had to join the coalition with the Conservatives, and that therefore caused destruction. There's the 1918 coalition equals his decline was inevitable. Then later on from that you start pointing at particular policies. You say his general policies caused problems, or the Chant crisis. Never argue the Chant crisis. This was the trigger, perhaps. It was not necessarily the cause. Well, it wasn't the cause. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go through each of these broad arguments one by one. We're going to really explain what the argument is, what the logic is, what you can use to point to prove it, and what are limitations and links of this. So the first argument is the idea that this was inevitable, key phrase, given the flaws in his character which caused the most damaging crisis and his fundamental poor reputation. And I've circled there the key phrases which we can attack. Whenever you are looking at an argument, one of the best ways to think about a rebuttal is to focus on the core assumptions that argument has made. But we'll focus on what the argument is first and any strengths of it before we move on. So this argument is essentially David Lloyd George. He is a force of nature, he's a highly effective individual, but he's also his own worst enemy. He is ambitious to the point of stupidity. He is ambitious to the point of destruction of both himself and his party. He is deeply arrogant and deeply corrupt on certain readings, and can we argue that this causes most of his crisis? So you can argue that this causes the 1916 crisis because of his own arrogance and ambition. We looked at that question previously. You can argue that the reason he goes into a 1918 coalition is because of his lust for power. You can argue the reason he goes back on some of his policies and he does all the mistakes that he does between 1918 and 1922, especially stuff like the honour scandal, are due to his lack of ideological zeal, a lack of ideological drive, lack of morality, and Chant crisis being evidence of that. So essentially this is very much a personal account. David Lloyd George ultimately causes the crisis. You can't just say David Lloyd George has a bad personality, David Lloyd George has ambition. You need to make it very clear in your argument how that causes him to fall from power. And then we can point particularly to the Chant crisis being a miscalculation of David Lloyd George, being too clever by half, which is a very David Lloyd George approach. We can point to the fact that he was deprived of a party base because of a split that arguably he created. And you can argue that if we can counter-argument one of the further factors, which is the 1918 coalition, which is saying if he wasn't so arrogant, would he have gone into that coalition when it's so clearly almost a suicide mission? This pie-in-the-sky dream to make a centre-right party was only that of a man who's desperate for power and will cling on to any random idea about how that would happen, even if it's quite clearly not going to happen. So this argument is one based on linking as opposed to how it directly causes on its own. Okay, so it's mostly focusing on how this is the root cause of all the other factors. So it's an interesting one to play around with, and it's an easy one to link most factors to. If we are going to deconstruct this, examples we can use to prove this. So we use Chant crisis, we can use the honour scandals as an example of this. Okay, and pretty much any other factors will link to it. If we are going to deconstruct this, we can work for it systematically. So number one, why is it inevitable, given the flaws in his character, that this would happen? And we can really challenge particularly the idea of, well, okay, if his character had flaws, how comes he was a very effective Prime Minister up until 1918? How comes he managed some of the most transformative change, and also was one of the most popular politicians, saw Britain through a deeply, deeply, unprecedentedly challenging war, and through the other side, united. And he was, in reality, a highly effective individual. Why then does he suddenly, by some miracle, stop becoming functional and causes all the problems? As well as that, we can say that, yes, he has flaws, and we might want to say, yes, he has flaws, particularly as a peacetime Prime Minister, and actually as a wartime Prime Minister, less so. And as a Chancellor, less so. Yes, he has flaws, but are they bad enough to cause the crises? So, for example, you can say, well, yes, he's amoral and has the honour scandal, but number one, there are many people who sell honours, it's not just him. It's not a unique flaw to David Lloyd George. Hubris and arrogance is certainly not new, and at least he has something to back it up. And we can really question the idea of how much did his character actually precipitate these other crises. So, for example, we can point out that, well, 1916, we can argue, is just as much David Lloyd George being heroic and stepping into breach of an incompetent Prime Minister, or due to Asquith rather than David Lloyd George. We can point out that 1918, had the party been formed, would have been seen as a seminal moment. David Lloyd George was a genius to create the new centre-right party. The only reason we judge it as a failure is because he failed, but doesn't necessarily mean it was inevitable that he would have failed. As well as this, 1918, there was no major parties. He's a person in political leadership. He is not, and we should not judge him harshly by his will to want to become leader. And in reality, the coalition worked well for 4 years, so clearly it had some viability to it. As well as this, we can point out, did the things that he caused, so you might want to say, yes, he did cause the split in the Liberals, yes, he did cause the honours crisis. Was that the most damaging thing? I'm sure it didn't hurt, or it didn't help. The honours scandal certainly hurt his reputation. But was he doomed from that point anyway? So actually, it doesn't massively matter that he has a flawed reputation, a flawed morality. Does the fact that he had quite publicly his mistress destroy his reputation, or was it more factors well beyond his control? And did he even have a relatively poor reputation all the way through, or was it only at the very end? And did he only have that poor reputation because by 1922 the Conservatives, who have decided to move on, wanted to see the worst in him, and therefore have chosen to focus on that? He was always the same character, even when they loved him in 1916. He is on record. Lord Curzon says he's a cad. There's a common joke that went around the cabinet that the ministers had to be encouraged not to tell their wives secrets in the war, during the war, in order to ensure that German spies don't talk to gossiping wives and get military secrets. And then it was wishfully pointed out that, does that apply to David Lloyd George and someone else's wife, whoever he happened to be that night? It's a different era. So we can argue, well, if it's his poor reputation which destroyed him, he did not change his real approach of government, his style, and his more amoral sides, if you wanted to call it that. Yet he was accepted by the Tories with open arms in 1916, and he was accepted with open arms when they were full knew this in 1918. So how could, in reality, that morality stuff be a big deal? Okay. So the big arguments here, obviously, it causes the crisis. The counter-arguments are, but does it really? And in those crises it does cause, do they really destroy his reputation, and do they really destroy him? Or would it have been destroyed anyway? Okay, so we really want to play around the idea of linking and what is the inevitable factor, what really causes it to happen. Okay, so that is the character argument. That's one of the more simple arguments, essentially. By being David Lloyd George, ambitious, greedy, amoral, he creates the crises, all the other factors to happen. And I would say your approach to this, therefore, would be, yes, it's true in this case, and this case. There are a couple of cases where he's more or less responsible for the crisis. But I would say you could also point out, well, a lot of those aren't fatal wounds. And actually, if they had his personality been so flawed, he wouldn't have gotten to his position he's already in. So perhaps it's personality and a context, and the context could be his personality plus the coalition of 1918 which causes it. Okay, next factor. So the split in the Liberals. This argument goes essentially, before the split in the Liberals, the Liberal Party was an irresistible force, or at least a strong political force. David Lloyd George could have been leader after Asquith. Had he waited, had he not split the party, had Asquith not split the party. You don't have to blame David Lloyd George for this argument. And that would have meant that David Lloyd George would have been leader of a united party, and therefore would have gone into 1918 with a much stronger party. If you add up the votes for National Liberal and add up the votes for Coalition Liberal and add up the votes for Liberals, you'd be almost competitive with the Conservative Party. And therefore that deprives debate. That would mean that he would have a majority, or at least a much bigger chunk of support, which he then can go into coalition with. Therefore, he'll be more powerful, and therefore he would have more control of his parties. Then, therefore, he's less likely to get kicked out. Okay, so splitting the Liberals equals we'll say from his equals his fall, because now instead of that hypothetical, he has a very small base of MPs, and therefore he's dependent on the Conservatives, and everything that happens as a result, the Conservative coalition equals his fall. So the thing which causes the coalition, which in turn causes his fall, is the split. So the arguments to support this, obviously you can point out the fact that he's got a minority in the government, and therefore he has to basically follow what the backbenchers says. Getting rid of Addison, for example, is that. Choosing the Conservatives over his own party. We can point out as well the fact there was a split vote, and we can also point out that the party could be unified as what happened after the 1924 election. However, I would say we could also do a lot to attack this. In reality, the Liberals you could argue, were not necessarily going to get a majority anyway, particularly the rise of the Labour Party. They might well have done better, but it's not as simple as adding up what the coalition Liberals got and what the Liberals got, because many of those coalitions, Liberals, if you remember, were Conservative voters who are voting in that area for the coalition Liberal. Okay, remember that's how the coupon election works. Avoid splitting the vote. As well as this, we can point out, yes, had David Lloyd George been part of the Liberal Party, he would have brought his popularity. But we can also point out the split was perhaps inevitable, and therefore, if the split was inevitable, was the factor of the split, or was the factor of the broader problems in liberalism? We can also point out that he does not necessarily have to go into coalition after the split, and the split doesn't necessarily have to be permanent, yet he makes those choices. Okay, so you can definitely argue in this one. The split puts him in a position where he kind of has to get in. If he wants to get into power, he has to go through coalition with Conservatives, but you could counter by saying, well, but he doesn't have to want to go into power. The split is very important, and you can't explain him getting into coalition without the split. His first preference is not to join the Conservatives necessarily. So what we've done in the last two arguments is really built up to this idea of actually it's a coalition of 1918, and that in reality your answer has to have at least some weight to the idea that the coalition of 1918 helps push him to, basically means that he will fall. And so therefore these last two factors are just, these equal coalition of 1918 equals fall. So it's just basically looking at the root of 1918 rather than saying that it's more important than 1918, if that makes sense. So essentially, the 1918 argument has three parts. Each of them are linked but slightly different. Okay, so number one, as a result of the 1918 election, he was completely dependent on the Tories. At any point, as this can be seen by the Charlton Club, because they have a pretty much workable majority, and essentially his government requires them in order to get anything through. Okay, he is utterly dependent on the Tories, and you can argue that this is essentially almost a sword of Damocles in that regard. It's essentially a something that will hang over his head and will be the death of him. And you can argue that had he been a non-coalition, this would not have happened to him. So essentially you can say that it was inevitable for 1918 because he is in a situation, the coalition now, where he's dependent on a different party's goodwill. And goodwill in politics never lasts forever. He will never be useful forever. And so therefore it was inevitable that there would be a bust-up. And because of that, it's inevitable he would lose power. Now the arguments against that. Yes, the Tories could remove him in power, but if it was so flippant, if it was like they were moving at any moment, why did he stay in power until 1922? Clearly he would have to do something wrong to annoy them enough to kick them out. If it was just as simple as he depends on Tories equals fall, why did he fall after 4 years? Why didn't he fall straight away? As well as that, we can argue, why couldn't he be politically useful forever? Why couldn't he be politically useful to enough Tories? That was his plan behind getting the centre-right party. Getting enough people who support him over the more right-wing of the Tories and left-wing of the Liberals. So there's nothing to say necessarily that this had to end in disaster. He could have either been absolutely brilliant and never put a step wrong, I'm not sure that's actually realistic, and therefore not annoyed the Tories, or he could have formed that centre-right party. The second argument, which is about 1918, is essentially something we've already mentioned. He has to, in order to stay popular, he has to be the face of the government. He has to stay popular because that's the only reason the Conservatives have got him. He's their cheerleader, he's their face, he's their brand. If the brand stops becoming good, then there's no point having the brand. So therefore he has to be the face and has to publicly be associated with all policies. In some cases, like the Treaty of Versailles, this works really well for him. In others, Chant, it does not. So you can argue because he's the face of success and because he's the face of failures, it means that he will because of the nature of the coalition government, he has to be in that position. He does not, what often prime ministers tend to do is they tend to make their ministers make a bit more of a public profile, so when things go wrong the ministers can also be blamed and sacked, but he can't do that. He has to be the face of everything. Now this in turn will mean that obviously governments will have failures and therefore he's going to lose popularity because he's going to be associated with failures. Now you can argue that David Lloyd George is an intelligent man. He knows this, so he would not rationally just dive in front of every single government policy unless it was part of a strategy. And the strategy quite clearly is he needs to be the face. Had he not been in coalition, he would not need to be the face of things as much, and therefore he would not take the blame as much, and therefore he would stay in power and the public's popularity as much. The counter-argument to this is, well, if he didn't make the failures, he wouldn't have to be the face of them. As well as this, you can argue he didn't have to take this line. He still could have tried to work the cabinet ministers to take the blame. That's a bit more unrealistic, but there's an argument that has been made. Finally, the last argument of 1918 is the idea that actually, because he is so dependent on the Tories, he has to make relatively he is confined and constricted in the policies he can make. He has made his name as a populist, but now he owes allegiance and his position to the right wing. He has to dance their tune, which means he basically has to do things a la social cuts and around the stuff around the miners and the unions, which he would not normally do. If you think about how nice he was and how reformist he was up until 1918, it's like you wouldn't recognise the same things he's been doing after 1920 unless you explain it by Tory pressure. So essentially what the Tory pressure makes him do is go against his political instincts, go against what his political base is, and upset the unions and masses. This in turn destroys his base of popular support, and therefore means no one on the left will support him. But also means once he's lost that popular support, he's not very useful to the Conservatives. So I mean, they'll get rid of him. So again, it's this idea, once he's been used up by the Tories but forced into a corner, therefore he's going to fall. Now the argument of this is he doesn't necessarily have to be forced into anything. As you can see by Chant and Ireland, he still does policies which the Tories don't necessarily listen to. And it's also worth pointing out that David Lloyd George has no belief in ideology in any way, shape or form. He will go with whatever is particularly useful. So in reality, he doesn't necessarily have to be forced into anything. He's always thinking about the bigger picture. He's always thinking about what keeps him in power. So this argument essentially is an inevitability argument. The structure of the constitution of the coalition, makes it so that he always has to make unpopular decisions and decisions which will politically harm him. It also means that he has a sort of Damocles hanging over his head, so he can be removed at any time. So essentially, this argument is very much an inevitabilistic argument. And is, I would say, quite an interesting one. I would say it's more interesting than the next one to come, which is it's about his policies. Because we can explain his policies and Chant as a result of this. Now, obviously in turn you can explain this stuff as a result of his personality, or as a result of the split. But I would contend that perhaps the personality split does not automatically mean coalition would be like this and coalition would happen. But it depends on how much you believe in free will, I suppose. So that is the 1918 election argument. Essentially, because he is in a coalition which A can get rid of him at any time, B will make him eat all the failures, and C will force him to do politically unpopular things, naturally he will automatically lose support. So this clashes quite a lot with the next argument, which says his policies alienate his support and could progressively weaken the people who would naturally support him, which means that eventually he would fall. So naturally he would fall. And then you just pick the event. You might want to say it's Ireland, you might want to say it's social reform. It'd be interesting to see an argument which says it's foreign policy. I doubt it, but who knows. In reality, this argument assumes that he has complete control and that he mucked up policy. And if you think, I would contend actually that much of it, at least the social spending stuff and the loss of the left-wing support and the mass support and the popular support, is a result of the coalition. He would not logically do 2 years of lovely times and make his reputation on being nice to the poor people, and then all of a sudden, as if by lightning, change over unless there is external pressure. And that weakens his support. And what essentially the importance of weakening the support means is once he loses support of the masses, that doesn't come back. So in 1922, what could happen, if he had still had to support the masses, is the Tories dump him, and then we have an election and he becomes leader again, so he doesn't fall. Or he loses power, but he comes back to power in 1924. So he's not fallen, he's just temporarily out of office. I would say the fall of David Lloyd George you can explain as him losing support so no one wants him back. And as certainly his policies do that. But we can also point out that not all of his policies can be explained by the coalition. He does not have to make a peace deal in Ireland. If he wants to get the Tories truly on his side, he'll just take a brutalist pro-Protestant line. And that doesn't work, and that doesn't happen. So clearly, if he was only following what the Tory backbenchers wanted, then why didn't he follow their line on the Ireland question? Okay, and there are arguments against that, but that's the point. As well as this, I would say, does it necessarily mean his fall is a certainty? Could he work his way out of there? And I would say I'm not massively convinced by this argument. You can pick certain events and say they're more important than others, and you can say how they contribute. These events certainly contribute, but when explaining why these events happen, it's important to reference the fact that actually David Lloyd George is hemmed in to some extent to decision making. He has to do these things. Essentially, this argument is interesting. I would say you can make it stronger. The Irish question is a good example of this, where this happens, but the rest of them, particularly the social spending stuff, as you saw in the last lesson, we don't necessarily have to say it's because of his poor decisions. It's because of a wider coalition thing. And the final one, the Chant crisis. Don't say it's a Chant crisis. Don't you dare say it's a Chant crisis. Chant crisis is not it. Chant crisis is the crisis which triggers it. But if it wasn't Chant crisis, it would have been something else. Like as mentioned before, the Tories should have loved the Chant crisis, but because of other factors, they have been put off by Ireland. This was inevitable from the start. David Lloyd George served his usefulness, whatever you want to argue. Because of other factors, they decide now's the time to prison shiv him, and now's the time to get rid of him. And so they choose the Chant crisis to be the major issue. That massively loses support as a result, and therefore he is done politically. So, essentially, when we are answering this question, one thing to think about is the oft-quoted argument that David Lloyd George ultimately is a politician of the 19th century. He's a man who bases it on flexibility, a man who bases it outside of crass party politics, and he emphasises his role of personality. If you remember, he actually always had the support of the front benches. It's the back benches that do him in. I would say there are two broad arguments one can make about this. One focuses on the very long term, and one focuses on 1918. So the very long term argument is essentially, yes, he is a flawed political figure, suited to being a second man or a wartime prime minister, where your zaniness and your emphasis and your ambition and your arrogance is channeled into effective policy, which either A, before the war, is that all the bad sides are sort of mitigated by having a prime minister who's in charge of keeping everyone happy, and during the war you don't need someone who is keeping everyone happy. You just need everyone's bound together with patriotism anyway. You don't have to worry so much about that. That in combination with that causes and is a significant factor in the ultimate split of the Liberals, which in turn means that his ambition to be leader is fundamentally impossible within the framework of the Liberal Party, and therefore leads to coalition, etc., etc., etc. So essentially it's the idea of he is a cruising ambition who destroys a party and still wants power. Now, then all the other factors spring from that, and you can put in whatever order you fancy. The second argument is that is recognisable, but ultimately it does not necessarily have to look like it looks like in 1918. It doesn't necessarily. His ambition isn't that overwhelming. He did not split the party. You might disagree with. You might say even if he does do those actions, he is a political genius. Why would he suddenly not realise that he will have a split party and realise that Asquith won't go down quietly? Like, he'll realise that. So clearly this is not necessarily the case, and you might therefore focus on the idea of what actually, tangibly, that we can solidly link, as opposed to just being a general influence, to him falling from power, and that's the 1918 stuff. That's it. 1918 sets up a circumstance where he will fall from power. And you might want to say, yes, he has a flawed personality, and that doesn't help, but that does not necessarily cause it directly. There are far too many variables, far too many other things. Yes, there's a split, but it doesn't necessarily mean he has to go into coalition. But again, that doesn't necessarily cause it. He could have made a centre-right party, etc., etc., etc. This argument, again, is one focused on the idea that because of this, he cannot essentially navigate the class differences, the class interest of the left and right, whereas there used to be a bit more of a one nation vibe in the world, in England at least, and therefore he cannot fundamentally run a coalition which covers his populism with the right wing, and he ends up being destroyed as a result of it. Do not argue, Chanak. I would say try and avoid arguing the major reason is policies after 1918, although you might want to explain they are the manifestations of the 1918 decision. It's been a weird one. It's always weird doing these essay question style ones because we don't really focus on anything too specific. But really focus, when you're writing this essay, focus on how does this cause the next thing in the chain. How does that create that next thing in the chain to happen? And therefore, it's very tempting for people to go at the very start of the chain, and they're arguing me, because this is at the start of the chain, this causes other things. Do not necessarily be tempted by that. You can also contend, yes, this is influential, but it doesn't cause, and therefore draw a line on this is where it actually starts to be cause, though. Before this, people could have made other decisions and it would have happened differently. Okay, bit of a weird one, bit of a British one. We're going to move on to the splitting the Liberals, which is going to be very, very similar in its approach. Okay, until then, I will see you in the next video.